Hi, I'm Tim Talen of the Ragwood Refactory. We've done a number of Interstate Cadet restorations here in the shop, and I get a lot of questions from guys asking about various situations that they've run into on their interstates. So I'd like to put together a couple of videos that will show some of the problem areas and then try to resolve and answer some of your questions by showing you how things are supposed to go on these things, how they're hooked up, how to adjust them, etc. So today I'd like to get started with the trim mechanism on these Interstate Cadets, and it's basically a simple process, but if you miss out on a few things, then you're going to start running into some trouble. So I've pulled an old elevator out of off the rack here because it's actually got some very nice things about it that are really very original, like this cover plate for the bottom of the trim mechanism to cover up the wheel is actually an original Interstate part, and it's got a little raised dimpled area right there that will allow the mechanism to move back and forth. So on this one here, you can see there's a wheel, a pulley basically put in there, and it rotates through about I don't know, 360 degrees, a little, well, more than about 270 degrees, and that actuates the push-pull mechanism to actuate the elevator. Now this one's broken here, so we'll have to replace and get a new one if we use this setup. But that's the basic idea: the wheel, and then essentially a stirrup here for a control mechanism, push rod, and then the cable mechanism. Now some of the guys are having trouble with where does this cable mechanism go, and as you can see, it's got it's set up so that in your cable housing you've got this little setup here, and the cables go right through the ribs on the elevator, and there's a screw and clamp operation that holds that in place, and it's this little bevel diagonal clamp, and that's supposed to go right there and clamp those guys and lock them in place. And you'll notice that there's only about an inch of housing, of casing here, and then the rest is cable. So this one goes here, and then this clamp on the elevator itself anchors the housing, the Bowden casings, onto the front of the elevator, and it's got room, a little bump here, enough room for the two housings to go, and then the cables actually lay in underneath this inboard hinge point here. So when you're doing your fabric work and putting this thing back together again, of course the stabilizer or the trim tab, you don't need that in place, but you'll fabric that right into place right there, and the fabric will go right around the end of the elevator there. And the other little trick to the trim mechanism is that this panel needs to have this strip put in here with 2 PK screws in the corner, and then you wrap right around and fabric up to here, but this is going to be all open on the bottom side. Then after the fabric is all done, this little guy slips in, and there's 5 or 6 PK screws that hold this cover on. The other little thing is on the top side, and that seems to be missed quite a bit. All right, we've got this little piece of balsa, and it just glues in here. You have to, because of the two bolts that are in here, screws that are in there, you've got to cut out a little bit of a slot on the inside of this thing, but then glue it in place, and then the fabric is going to go over the top of that. And this will raise the fabric up, keep it out of the way of the moving mechanism that's going to be inside there that has to have room to move. So get a little slot in that little block, and that will take care of that little issue right there. And then you'll have a nice fabric job, and the only thing that will show up on the top of it is this little balsa piece. Now, one of the other things I want to point out about the pulley mechanism is when you're installing this, the stirrup part needs to have a little bushing on the inside there, because you'll notice that the slot is a 1/4 inch wide, but the clevis pin that goes through to hold it is a 3/16. So you need a 1/4 inch bushing with a 3/16 inside diameter to install that so that it operates properly. Some fellas have complained that there's a lot of slop in their system. It's sometimes because the bushing is missing and is not there. So make sure you've got that bushing. Make sure you've got a good bronze bushing on the center that's good and snug, and that will hold all of this in good position and good working order for you. Now from here, and we'll show you on another fuselage in a minute, where this goes to into the inside of the fuselage when you're assembling your airplane, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But you'll notice the ends of the cable here. You've got one turnbuckle and one just open loop, and that joins onto the cables that go up to the fuselage or up to the cabin. This wrap of Bowden casing and so forth, and it has on the tail end of it has the opposite end for the turnbuckle, and then this other loop, and these two loops get put together. These two loops get put together with an AN3 bolt and a couple of large area washers to hold that unit together. So that's your connection for your trim mechanism from your elevator into your fuselage up to your trim crank. So at the front end of this, and we'll show how this all attaches onto the top of your fuselage structure up to the front. And there's the typical chain and a little sprocket up in the front. That's your trim mechanism, which comes through, and then you've got the crank on the inside of the top of the cabin for your trim mechanism. So most of these chain units, well, you should have stops on them. So make sure that you've got your stops in place right at the ends. It's just to prevent that trim mechanism from running off of the sprocket and getting jammed up in there. And these will stop the chain action. So make sure you've got those in, and they're generally placed almost right at the very end of the chain. You'll notice when you're installing your trim tab that the correct situation here is that there is no screw right here. You can see there's two screw heads here, but none here. The reason there isn't is because that runs right into that stirrup control push rod mechanism. So you'll have 3 screws at the ends and 2 in the middle, but none there. Even though they drilled a hole there, you should not put a screw in that particular hole because it's just going to run interference with your mechanism in there. Here we are on the back end of an Interstate Cadet that we've been putting together in the shop, and we'll point out a couple of things about what we saw earlier in the video. But I wanted to point out where the cables come out from the trim mechanism. They go underneath the stabilizer here and go into the side of the fuselage right at this point up here, down underneath the stabilizer. There's been quite a bit of question about where these guys go, but they're supposed to go in right there. And then up inside the fuselage, there's a little attachment plate up there, which you should probably locate and get all of this stuff set up before you cover the airplane so you know where you're going with these things. There's a little plate up inside here that bolts on to the plate on the end of these things, and that holds all of this mechanism in place. So these cables will do just really nicely here, right on the bottom of the elevator, and they shouldn't give you any trouble in that location. Earlier we were talking about the trim tab and the number of screws that you put in, and see on this finished airplane where we've already done all our fabric work, no screw in this position, but you can faintly see the little balsa buildup right here that we were talking about that goes underneath the obviously under the fabric on top of the mechanism on there, and that's what that should look like. So there's a good setup, trim tab in place, fabric, everything is ready to go.